My name is Amy Glasmeier, and I'm a professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning. I am trained as a planner and an economic geographer, and most of my work has been involved in examining the ways in which industrial activities have evolved over time and how that results in the formation of labor markets and cities, regions, and in some cases, global industries. So what is an economic geographer? I'm sure in this set of presentations, you've heard from a lot of different kinds of geographers, and an economic geographer is a very specific type of geographer. And to me, it's one of the more, I would say, foundational subfields within economic geography. And the reason is because it started out to be basically a practice of accounting for the wealth and resources of explorers around the world. So when they would go off in their ships or they would traverse across landscapes, they would be accompanied by a cartographer and usually an economic geographer and probably a biogeographer. And their jobs were basically to account for what were the material assets that individual countries had controls over. Fast forward the tape to the year 2023, and what economic geographers do is a lot of other things other than accounting for the resources and wealth of the world. We study the spatial distribution of people, places, things, and their interactions. And we use spatial and economic concepts to explain the reality we experience daily. When I use the term spatial, what I'm talking about is the physical world, the surface of the earth, and the ways in which it's divided up and redivided over the course of history. We utilize certain tools and certain concepts to explain the relationships between peoples, places, and things and their interactions. We utilize distance, proximity, remoteness. We use these to describe spatial relationships among people, places, and things, and even ideas and institutions. We draw from fields of geographic thought, including location, urbanization, and scale. Now, the term proximity takes on new meaning with the emergence of COVID, the recognition of political institutions and interactions and technological change. I am going to use the case of COVID to talk about proximity and its relationship to geography throughout this presentation. The geography of proximity, the case of COVID. The thing that's been most amazing is, and we all know, is we've lived through 3 years of the most unsettling experience in probably 100 years, and that is the COVID pandemic. But we have to remember that the COVID pandemic was not the first. And as a matter of fact, there have been many pandemics over the course of history. People have records to indicate there's at least 249 examples of pandemics from 1200 BC up until the COVID crisis. The one that the Americans know the most about probably, or at least they have some memory of it, is the 1918 Spanish influenza. What's interesting about it is we actually have a lot of different opinions of where the Spanish influenza started and how it started, but there's really still no specific agreement on where the disease actually emerged. One view is that the disease emerged in Haskell County, Kansas, an isolated, sparsely populated county in the southwestern corner of the state. One of the first recorded cases was March 11th, 1918 at Fort Riley, Kansas. So the sense was that it started on a military base. And the reason that it had some prospect for that to be true is because that particular setting was overcrowded and unsanitary at that time due to the circumstances taking place in the world and the prospect of war. And so that kind of context, overcrowding and unsanitary conditions, traditionally were thought to be breeding grounds for viruses. Another view is that the disease resulted from Chinese or Vietnamese laborers crossing the United States or working in France. So we don't still exactly know, but if you have a story in your mind of what the event, where the event was precipitated, it happens to be this location in Kansas. Now, COVID is an example of an influenza, a disease that was able to pervade around the world in many places. Some places it didn't go to, but in many places. COVID's origin is also under investigation. Some people believe it came out of a laboratory in China. Some people believe that it came out of an animal market in China. Whether we ever actually establish the truth is to be determined, but the key is that it was a disease that transmitted at incredible rates, and it was able to move across a country in about 12 days. It first based on the geography of the immediate proximity and ultimately through human contact to more distant locations. And the first experiences of COVID were not just immediate deaths, just pervasive deaths. It was much more a buildup and a precipitation of the dispersal of the disease and the vulnerability of populations that brought the trajectory of death and illness to the fore. The one thing that's different between the 1918 Spanish influenza and COVID is that we actually had the ability to document what happened. And so you will be 20 years from now, and you'll be able to open up a textbook in any biology or any political or geography book, and you will see the transmission of the disease across the world. And it is a remarkable story. So let's take a look. Here is the Wuhan animal market. When I say it's an animal market, it's a market that, and it's a market that you find in any one of the large Chinese cities. It basically is a market with live animals of all different types, sizes, and character. And people buy them for pets. They buy them for the purposes of food. They buy them for the purposes of comfort and care. So here we are, we're at a bird's eye view, and this is the point that many people believe was the start of the pandemic. The first cases of COVID were reported in December 2019 in Wuhan, China, but it wasn't long before there was a passage of people from Wuhan, China to the United States. And it took us a while to actually figure out what happened. And I'll say more about that in a minute. Wuhan is a very big city. It is also a historic city in terms of its role as the center of governance in China back in time. It's about 11 million people in population. It's also, interestingly, a landscape that has a very moist environment. So, as we all know, moist environments are perfect breeding environments for diseases like influenza, colds, and things like that. So the disease started in Wuhan in December. Its next location where we began to hear something about it actually was all the way over in the United States, and I'll make a point of that in a minute. But in less than a month, on January 23rd, authorities placed Wuhan under quarantine, suspending all flights, trains, and long-haul buses in and out of the city. I had a former postdoc who was communicating with me as it began, and ultimately sent me face masks because you couldn't get them in the United States at the time. And he said that the whole city, all the way out to the edges, was being locked down. The World Health Organization commended the city for shutting everything down, which was incredible to do because of how many people were going to be confined. By the end of January, the disease had spread to 15 additional cities, and over 57 million people had been affected by the quarantines, more than the entire population of Colombia or South Korea. So here we see Wuhan in the middle, and we see this sort of spreading web of cities. And you can notice something on this map that are really important is we have big and we have small cities that have been basically cordoned off. So if you take this whole region, it was essentially closed off, and the Chinese government wasn't prepared for the food supply that was going to be needed, the drugs that were going to be needed. They were building a hospital a day for thousands of people who were being sick. This map shows the further pervasiveness of the quarantine in China, scaled by population. And so you can see that in fact, the cities that were being cordoned off were of a variety of different sizes. But what we also see is that the spread was moving into other countries within the region and larger populations. This is a picture of the global dispersal pattern. And one of the most interesting issues was one of the outbreaks in the United States and one that really got a lot of attention. There were two. One was in Seattle, Washington, somebody having come from China and was ill, and that began to spread. And the other was an interesting conference in Boston, Massachusetts, where I live. And it was a conference by Biogen, a giant life sciences biopharma company. And there were 200 people at this conference, and they were all in the same room for 5 days. At the end of the 5 days, everybody dispersed. And we had our first outbreak of COVID within the day after everybody disappeared. And the interesting thing is my son's boss was at the Biogen conference, and she came back to the office on the third day, and she infected many of the people that she worked with. But this just gives you the sense. This is, from a time perspective, we are now in February. The reason that what you just saw was this very sort of, almost fireworks pattern is because that's what the pathways of airlines actually look like. So what we would expect as geographers is this concentration of places most proximate to begin with, but then as the population moves, first in simple terms, walking around, then riding in cabs, then riding in buses, and getting on trains, and then eventually getting on airplanes, that we would see this sort of starburst pattern. And as we see these long tentacles reaching out to the rest of the world, we can measure the pace of transmission of the disease and its mutation, which was also very important. This map confirms the cases of COVID by metropolitan area. And over a very short period of time, by May or June, we basically had infected the world. Now you can see that there are really different sized areas in terms of population and metropolitan scale, where we see these concentrations of COVID. Some of this is a little bit uncertain. One of the challenges during the COVID crisis was that we didn't have perfect information from all of the countries in the world. We didn't even have perfect coordination or perfect assistance from countries around the world. One in particular in Russia basically made little communications possible. They basically acted on an insular basis, which meant that we knew very little about what was going on in Russia, but we also knew very little about what was the mutated form of COVID in Russia. And Russian wasn't the only place where you had difficulty getting information. North Korea was another location where you had difficulty getting information. But you can see from this map that over a very short period of time, the whole world had basically been affected. Now, one of the interesting statistical issues was how to determine who had COVID and who died from COVID. The American public health system couldn't keep a grasp on the statistics. And eventually, the way we were able to track the deaths of COVID was by a small research enterprise at Boston University that was set up by an organization on campus about race and racism. And the reason that that organization ended up being the information feed is because they had a program that was basically about African Americans, and African Americans were particularly susceptible to this disease, and they were getting undercounted. So the university took over, and eventually the federal government had them actually the organization that was collecting the data. So how did the COVID pandemic change our lives and give new meaning to geographic remoteness? So here is a cartogram of the death toll for COVID over the course of less than a year. And what we can see is it's a little bit difficult because you can't really tell that in March, up in the very far northwestern corner of the cartogram is Seattle. And that was the place that people felt was where the disease first entered the United States. But you can see March, April, May, by then we have this intensive trajectory over a very short period of time to see how the dispersal pattern went. So it basically went straight across the country at the upper edge of the nation. And eventually it filtered down through the Midwest. And this is, as an economic geographer, I interpret this as happening as a result of the fact that that northeast southwest corridor is where a lot of the national goods and services are produced, a lot of transportation technology is, and the population concentration. Though the population concentration is actually today in the South and the Western United States. So you can see that it begins to break up. By November, there's almost no place that had been unaffected by COVID and experienced deaths. So in addition to this, so this pervasiveness process, this process of first proximity, but then dispersal, leads to a remarkable transformation in the United States economy. And we began to see a nation of employment that we had never seen before. It was a nation first of proximity, but ultimately it was a nation of dispersal. What happened? Well, the first thing that we figured out was that there was a very rapid development of a set of public policies to do a couple of things. One was to develop the medications that were going to be needed and the rapid development of the viral suppressant disease materials. The second thing was that people were losing their jobs right and less. The third thing was that we had a incredible need for people who were doctors and nurses and public health persons and fire department and police and people working in elderly care locations. All of those had to be totally reorganized, and they had to in many cases, the most important people, the people that were in healthcare, were essentially absorbed and used in such an intense way. They worked sometimes 24 hours a day and they'd have a day off, or they might work 16 hours a day and then they do that for several periods. So there was a huge transformation in the American workforce. More people came in to some of these care-based occupations, and many people were basically sent home out of their work environment because it was a contagious disease and they didn't want people to be working close to one another. Another issue that happened very quickly was that Americans lost their jobs. So the federal government developed a series of programs that gave people who had previously been employed, who were unemployed, they gave them a stipend of $600 a week for 4 weeks a month till the fall of the first year of COVID. That kept the American economy from completely collapsing. And it was a profound experience. It was also an experience that showed us that that's $2,400 a month per person working in a household. For the people who received it, they basically were able to cover the cost of most of their bills. The other truly profound development was the economy couldn't just collapse. So we had to find a way to disperse people. People had to go to work. People had to go to hospitals and various kinds of care locations. So we developed a series of procedures so that people could be in a work environment, but at a safe in a safe context. We went home, we brought our computers and our internet and all of the other things that we needed, and we developed what has now become a remote-driven economy. We basically have unglued people from the place of traditional work. And we're right in the process now of trying to figure out what and how we will change in the face of this practice. So these statistics are remarkable. 58%, or about 92 million people, said they worked remotely at least part of the time during COVID. We changed ourselves basically completely. Some people who were in strategic jobs that could not work at home were then essentially in protected clothing for many days at a time, taking care of different facets of work. So proximity was this powerful influence in percolating this disease that transmitted over about 6 months all around the globe. Proximity next to one another is this notion of I'm here and I'm proximate to someone else. Well, COVID gave a completely new meaning to proximity, because proximity essentially transformed from proximity to pervasiveness, and the world is still in a state of recovery. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the other programs.